I was always a difficult child. I would ask questions from my parents, from my teachers, and I remember my earliest memory of feeling deeply uncomfortable when I was 10 years old. I was being driven to school and the car had stopped at a traffic light. And I was wearing a gray skirt and a white shirt and going my school uniform. And I looked out of the window and I saw a girl. She was my age, but she was barefoot, her hand was stretched out, and her nose was pressed against the glass window. And I remember thinking that why is it that I am sitting in the car and she is, standing outside begging? And I remember thinking that why isn't she at school? And I went home and asked those questions, and my mother, who was raising 6 children, didn't have time to answer all of these questions. So by the time I was 14 years old, she encouraged me to begin writing for English language newspapers in Pakistan. And she said, in her own words, why don't you ask someone else these difficult questions? And so began my journey as a journalist. By the time I was 17, I was confident enough to pitch for investigative pieces. My first big investigative piece appeared on the morning of the Muslim holiday of Eid. And I remember it so vividly because it was a thrill to see my name in print, but not so much a thrill when I heard my father's voice bellowing through the house. The young men that I had written about had spray painted my name and my family's name with unspeakable profanities on our gate, on our boundary wall, and on all of the walls in our neighborhood. And they had done it to shame my family, to silence me, to make me feel afraid. And when you're 18 years old and when you're a young woman in a country like Pakistan, that's a career-ending move for many. And I thought my father, who was a very strict man, would just have ended my career that day. But he said something to me that has always stayed with me. If you speak the truth, I will stand with you, and so will the world. And I've always carried that with me. I went off to college in America, and I was at Smith College when the tragic events of 9/11 happened. I was all set to either join a bank or work for the UN. I was still writing articles, but I didn't think that that would be my calling. But watching the news pour in and watching the reactions and looking at what was happening in my part of the world, I began to think that I wanted to do something visual. So this is the days of pre-Google. I went online and I typed in visual journalism, and the word documentary films popped up. And I'd never really paid attention to documentary films, and I thought, right, that's my calling. I'm going to be a documentary filmmaker. In December 2001, when the bombing in Afghanistan started, I came to Pakistan. And the thing that really hit me was the sheer number of Afghan refugee children on the streets of Karachi. And everyone was talking about the war, but no one was talking about the youngest victims of the war. And I wanted to tell personal interest stories about these children. So I wrote up a proposal and I sent it to about 80 organizations across the United States. And the New York Times had just opened a television unit. And as one does, one sent the email off and waited, and within 15 minutes a response had come. And I remember buying my first suit and getting on an Amtrak train and arriving in New York at the New York Times and entering this boardroom with some very serious people with dark suits and pitching to them that I wanted to make this film. At the end of the pitch, I was offered, not only were they going to fund my first film, but they were also going to train me in the summer before I went off to Pakistan. An important lesson that I learned at that time in my life was that if a door hasn't opened for you, it's because you haven't kicked it hard enough. My first film was called Terror's Children, and it followed the lives of about 7 Afghan refugee children on the streets of Karachi. When we got to the edit room and the editor began looking at all of the footage, he decided that he would have me as the person who takes the journey and explains to the audience, the reporter in the film. And so an accidental filmmaker became an accidental reporter on camera. And so my first few films all are about my journey to different parts of the world. Me going to Saudi Arabia to look at women's rights over there. South Africa, where I was looking at xenophobia against Zimbabweans and Somalian refugees. I feel like there's a fatigue in the world about listening to stories that have a difficult context. And that's why my storytelling is rooted in creating empathy. My storytelling is rooted in creating compassion, in connecting people. I bring people's deeply personal stories out so that the viewers watch and connect and can feel that I could be this mother, this could be my child, this could be my country, this could be my people. Because for too long it has always been us and them. But really, it should be about all of us, that all of us can find ourselves in difficult circumstances. That's why I try and find people who can eloquently tell their stories. The first time I met Zakia, one of the main protagonists in Saving Face, and saw that half her face had melted, I found it very difficult to speak to her, because I could not imagine that this woman whose husband had thrown acid on her face simply because she had dared to ask for a divorce could wake up every morning with a smile on her face, raise her 2 children, and face the world. I thought to myself, how would I be if something like this had happened? And Zakia gave me the strength to tell her story and to tell the story of all of those women in Pakistan who had been affected by acid violence. When Saving Face came out, we were shocked that it received a nomination for an Academy Award. And I think that all of Pakistan was overjoyed that a Pakistani filmmaker could receive a nomination at the Academy Awards. Around the same time, acid violence, which was rarely reported in the newspaper, relegated to the back pages, began to make front page news. The chief minister of one of the largest, most populous provinces in the country where acid violence was concentrated took notice. He saw the film, there was discussion about this issue, and one thing that stood out at that time was the fact that so many women did not go to court, afraid that they would not get justice, or that it would take 6 or 7 years for them to pursue the case. Special courts were set up so that victims and survivors of acid violence could get speedier justice. So instead of waiting for 6 to 7 years, they could get justice in 6 months. That encouraged more women to come forward and begin to report that this had happened to them. Winning the first Academy Award is such a blur, and it's also, I think, the stuff that dreams are made of. But coming back to Pakistan after that, and seeing how my voice was amplified, I began to realize that there is a serious responsibility, that the issues that I bring to the forefront can affect policy change, can affect the way people look at issues. And thus I began thinking about the kind of films I wanted to make, the kind of issues I wanted to tackle. About 2 years later, in 2014, I began to think about honor killings. And we'd all grown up hearing stories about honor killings, but again, it was not something that was discussed widely. It was one morning, I woke up and picked up the newspaper, and I found a tiny story, literally 3 lines. A young woman had been shot and thrown in the river in what appeared to be an attempted honor killing. And I remember calling my co-producer, Haya, and calling other team members and saying, find this young woman, and this could be our story. And so the team scrambled and everyone went off their different ways, and we made the calls. And fortunately, Saba, a 17-year-old girl that had been shot by her father and her uncle, put in a gunny bag, thrown in a river, had miraculously survived. The rescue services had found her, sent her to a hospital, and the doctors were working on her. So my first memory of Saba is this feisty young woman lying in a hospital bed, commanding things, telling my team you know, that we should interview her mother-in-law, that we should interview her sister, that we should interview her father. And it was almost as if she was made to be on television. And imagine this young, illiterate girl from a small town in Pakistan had the courage to share her story and to share what had happened to her, to inspire others, to act. She wanted to send her father and her uncle to prison. She said to us, I want to tell my story because I want what has happened to me not to happen to any other young woman in this country. We began filming A Girl in the River. The team and I thought that this was going to be a story about triumph. It was going to be a story about a young woman who fights, who sends her father and uncle to jail, who stands up to society. But instead, after spending countless days and following her as she went in and out of courtrooms, we realized that the family and her neighborhood had pressured her to forgive her father and her uncle. And I'll never forget that day because I think the team almost broke down. You know, we heard the news, we walked out, sat in the car and talked amongst ourselves. How was this happening? And this wasn't the film that we had anticipated it was going to be. We finished filming and as we began to think about Saba's decision to relent, she said something to us. I have forgiven my father and my uncle for the world, but in my heart they remain unforgiven. And then that became the ethos of the film. When the film was nominated for an Academy Award, the Prime Minister's office sent out a statement congratulating me. Then the Prime Minister hosted the first ever screening of a documentary film that has ever taken place in Pakistan. And I remember when we were walking into the hall, he turned to me and asked me, how long is this film? And so many people in the audiences, so many people in the audience that day told me that, you know, we've never had this happen. So it was a very important moment for Pakistan. We went to LA and we were the dark horse that year. We weren't even in the top 3 to win. And so as I sat in the theater and watched the announcements take place over and over again, we were convinced that we were not going to walk away that year with a golden statue. But of course, our name was announced and I bounded up the steps and won. And you know, winning that day wasn't simply about winning another statue. It was about ensuring that this issue was going to get the prominence that it needed, that the law was going to be passed. And right after that win, I went back to Pakistan and we began to lobby the government and began to put pressure. We held over 300 screenings of the film across the country, launching a nationwide campaign on honor killings, working with activists, working with young people, going into colleges, universities, schools, community centers to start an important dialogue. And 6 months later, a watered down version of the law was indeed passed. How do you galvanize a nation to talk about a difficult issue like honor killings? We were fortunate that the Academy Award win pushed prominent journalists in the country, pushed editorials, pushed radio shows about the issue of honor killings. Perpetrators of honor killings, victims of honor killings, survivors, all were put on the news. And the question that everyone was asking was, how are we allowing this to happen on our watch? I've always found that my being a woman is my greatest asset because it allows me to go into places where male filmmakers wouldn't normally get access. But it also gives me this status of an honorary man. So I'm able to go into places where men go as well. So it's actually a really big advantage to be a female filmmaker in Pakistan. I've found that I've been able to cloak myself in and out of places and get the story that I've always wanted to. Filmmakers make films, but who sees those films? Where do they go? From the cinema to the television screen. But how often do they reach the people who need to see it the most? That's something that I was grappling with and thinking about. And then a few years ago, I came up with the idea of creating a mobile cinema. Taking these films into these communities where they haven't had an opportunity to watch these films has been deeply satisfying. Our truck pulls up often in areas where children have had no entertainment, where women have not seen any of these films. When the films are over, the communities talk amongst themselves. Not usually where the films are being screened, but at home and afterwards. The ripple effect is great. And so we are starting conversations across the country about issues that people need to be talking about.